Before you can catch a trout in a river, you've got to figure out where they're living, and we're going to talk about just that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us, as always, by the folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. And also the team at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado, ready to take care of all of your Toyota car and truck needs. Guys, trout fishing, one of my favorite things, not something we do a lot of, which is silly considering it's one of my favorite things, but ever since I moved to Colorado as a kid, trout and rivers, I gravitated to them right away, and I love to do it. It's really fun. Everywhere around the area where I live, there's all kinds of rivers to fish, and I thoroughly enjoy it with both a fly rod and a spinning rod. But I got a request from a viewer about breaking down a trout river as far as locating fish. And I thought, well, okay, that seems like a good thing to talk about since it's something I like to do. And so here we go. We're going to talk about breaking down a trout river and how we would go about locating the fish within that river or deciding where to fish. Now, I'm going to throw out a couple things really quick. First of all, this will be relevant to fly and spin anglers. Conventional anglers, fly guys will both be relevant to here. However, I do more of my river fishing with a spinning rod than I do a fly rod, which is almost counterintuitive because the bulk of my fly fishing is in still water. And that has to do with the fact that more than anything else, when it comes to fly fishing, I like to cast a fly rod. And when you're in a stillwater environment, in almost all cases, you get a chance to really stretch out and cast. And you can make long casts, you can do big long strips, you can make all kinds of casts. And it's not the same as a river situation where you have to set up a drift and then change your angles and all of those other things. And I'm capable of doing them. I've done it my whole life. As soon as I moved to Colorado as a kid, I picked up a fly rod because I thought that's what you had to do. I learned it from some of the best around in those days up in Evergreen, Colorado. And I love to do it. I still to this day love to do it. But because fly fishing in a river doesn't necessarily involve the nice long casts and a bunch of fly line in the air and all of that, I don't do it as much. Furthermore, I'm not a huge fan of nymphing, and nymphing is by far the most consistent, in my opinion, when it comes to catching trout in a river. I'm not a big fan because of the same reason. I don't like to cast the strike indicator and the split shot and the multi-fly rigs and all that stuff. So if I'm going to fly fish, I want to throw a streamer fly or a dry fly, some sort of wet fly, something like that. So most of this conversation that I'll have here is going to revolve around those presentations, not high sticking or Euro nymphing or anything like that. Flip side of it is I do a ton of river fishing with a spinning rod, and I'm a big fan of that. I love doing it. It rewards casting accuracy at a high level. It rewards line control at a high level, more so than still water does in most scenarios. So I really enjoy that challenge that goes with fly fishing that goes spin fishing in a river. So it's going to be a little bit relevant to both of those things, but I just wanted to set some background right there. So I'm going to start off with this. I was asked a long time ago, you get $10,000, but you get 3 minutes to catch a fish. From the time you're at the body of water, you get 3 minutes. And they asked where I would go, what would I do? And this was on a radio show, so I was kind of caught off guard in the public eye, so to speak, and on a live radio deal. And the first thing I blurted out was, well, I would go to a river and try to catch a trout, because in 3 minutes, I can't learn a whole bunch about a lake, but in 3 minutes, standing on the edge of a river, I can get a pretty good idea about what's going on with the river because of some key things. We'll talk about that in a minute. Well, what happened was I got blasted by both love mail and hate mail. And most of it was hate mail saying that's dumb, rivers are actually harder than lakes, blah, blah, blah. And I disagree. As much as I hate to say that, with all due respect, I disagree. And here's why. The key about a river is because it's got significant current. And let me back up a tiny bit. The key about a freestone river that I'm exposed to here in the West more often than not. If you're in a big, slow, deep river, maybe some bets are off. But a normal freestone river of some sort, or even a spring creek of some sort, these same things are going to apply. If you're talking about the Mississippi River or the Missouri River that's 3 casts across, well, maybe not so much, or the lower Colorado that's 8-10 feet deep and you can't really even read the water hardly at all. But I'm talking about a standard, normal Colorado River in the mountains, all the different ones, the Arkansas River, the Frying Pan, the Roaring Fork, all the different rivers here in the West that people fish, the Green River, things like that, where you've got runs, pockets, the whole 9 yards, pools, the whole situation. And so in that scenario, with only a few casts, I can make a pretty good determination of whether my fish are in runs or riffles or plunge pools or whatever, so long as I've got a lure I think they will respond to. So I can make 2 casts into a run, 2 casts into a pool, 2 casts into some pocket water, a couple of casts, into whatever else is there for variety, and have a pretty good idea that everybody there saw my lure and will give me some feedback. And the reason is trout are very excitable. So a trout in a river, even if I don't catch them, will clue me in right away as to what's going on. So if I had to make that bet, I still to this day, that was years ago that I made that comment, and I still get hate mail about that, but I'm standing by it. If I've got to catch a fish immediately and all other things being equal, I'm going to a river, whether I know that river or not, because I feel like I can break it down the fastest. So I don't want to make that sound disrespectful to people that trout fish, because it's not. It's not meant to be that way. But when it comes to breaking down a lake versus a river, I have some key things in the river that go my direction. One of them is the visibility of the water moving. I can tell which way my fish will be facing because they're pre-programmed to face up current. So first of all, I know which direction they're facing always. And I get it, there might be eddies and swirls and all those kinds of things and seams, but it's still going to put me in the 90th percentile of being correct of which way my fish are facing. Along those same lines, it's going to tell me where they're sitting as well, because it's not a lot of scenarios where they're going to sit in really fast water and paddle. So I can eliminate that unless they're actively feeding. And so it goes back to what I just said. In a couple of casts, I could find out whether or not they're in that kind of water, because if they're actively feeding, you're going to know it right away. They're at least going to look at what you threw. So it just gives me an easier chance to determine where they're sitting, and in a cast or two determine where I might be able to catch them. So let's look at some basic scenarios here and determine how I would break them down. So first of all, we're going into mud season. So mud season meaning the high water, the melt off, the high country's melting. The river might be clear in the morning and muddy in the afternoon. It might be muddy the whole time. But mud season is one of my favorite times to fish for trout in the river. And the reason is all those things I just said a minute ago are amplified even more, because high water comes with mud season. So you've got heavy flows and a lack of visibility in the water. So the lack of visibility tells me I can throw a big bait, which is easy to control and easy to cast accurately, for one. For two, I don't have to worry about the element of stealth, which is a key thing as well, which is in a low clear river I might, or even just a normal river color, I might have to worry about stealth because the water's shallow, which gives the fish the widest field of view based on how their vision reflects on the surface. And then also that heavy muddy flow will pin the fish into specific locations. So the first thing I'm going to say is if there's heavy water, especially if it's muddy, but if it's running really hard, harder than normal, the first thing I'm going to do is start beating up all the seams along the edges of the banks. And it could be with a hard bait or a jig or who knows what, could be with a streamer fly. But I'm going to really focus on the seams that run right down the edges of the banks. And what I mean by the seam is the fast water that's going ripping by because the river's high is going to meet the turbulent water right at the edge, and I mean right at the edge, within a foot of the edge of the bank, and there's going to be some small little eddies and vortices and everything else that go along right there with fluid dynamics, and I'll spare you the details. My background is in aerospace engineering, but I'll spare you the fluid dynamics details. At the end of the day, it gives trout some slack water to sit in and dart out into the current and grab anything that they can, or conversely grab anything that's coming down the river. And so it really pins them to the banks. So the first place I'm always going to be looking at in that scenario is to the banks. Now, somebody's going to say the big deep plunge pools and there's more still water when it's running hard, and that's true. But it's harder for trout in that scenario to locate their food. If they've got a conveyor belt that's just ripping by them all day long, they can keep an eye on that, sit right against the bank, not have to paddle at all, and grab anything that comes by. If we're talking about trying to address them in the plunge pools and things like that, you're talking about typically much deeper water, and trout that could be facing any which way within that plunge pool, so you have a chance of spooking them with your lure. And also, I can't use the water to my advantage as much to move my lure, because again, it's turbulent and flowing every which way and whatever. So the muddy water is awesome, and as far as I'm concerned, because then I know where they're sitting. I also know I can get the big bait out, like I said, and I can get after them. There's an old wives' tale that trout don't feed in the muddy water, and that's because people don't catch as many of them a lot of the scenarios. But if you address fishing in muddy water, the high rivers with mud in them, the same as you do the rest of the time you fish the river, you're going to struggle for sure. And then for two, the trout have a hard time locating lures or flies in the muddy water. So the muddier the water is, the more aggressively I can fish. And we did a show years and years ago. This has been 12 or 15 years ago even at this point, where we were fishing a river that was completely out of its banks, like to the point of flood stage. And I thought, well, this will be a fun time to go address the fish. Well, even there, I underestimated how hard they would be to locate my lure, and I struggled the first part of the day. And what happened is I just kept upsizing and upsizing and upsizing. And before it was all said and done, if you guys are familiar, this was a long time ago, keep in mind, if you guys are familiar with a number 13 floating Rapala, that is a 13 centimeter long bait. It is a big bait. That's what I ended up catching all my fish on. And the reason I was able to catch them on that, most of them I caught by throwing it out into the heavy current, letting it swing up against the bank, and then swimming it back up the edge of the bank in the rough water as though it was struggling to hold up in the current. The big bait was the most critical thing that day, and that stuck that lesson in my brain, and I've been that way ever since. So as soon as I get to the river and I realize it's really muddy and the water's high, I'm going for the biggest baits I'm carrying, and that's going to help you out a whole bunch. But again, it's going to be all about finding the seams. It might be a seam between fast current and slow current, or it might be a seam along the bank themselves. But when it's high, and especially if it's dirty, you can count on them being pinned into those places and not moving much. And the hard part about getting them to bite is only getting them to locate your bait. So that's where you need your bright colors, your really dark colors for contrast, your noisy baits potentially, things with heavy vibration, heavy duty flash, things like that will help you in that scenario as well. Let's talk about more normal scenarios now. Say mud season's over and the water level's starting to come down a little bit, and now we're in a more normal situation, which basically encompasses the bulk of the fishing season. Now they could be in the seams along the edges, they could be in the seams between two currents. They're moving at different speeds, and so similar to the way that the vortices form along the bank, where the rip currents are going along the bank in heavy flows, in normal flows you'll get areas where fast water runs by slow water, and it will create an edge right there. And I'm all about edges. We've done whole podcasts about edges, so I will target those on a fairly regular basis as well. But it opens up. Once the water clears up, it opens up more places that they can sit within the river, particularly once the flows come down a little bit, because there's more seams that are manageable for the fish. Then the other thing I'm going to look at besides seams, always my first thing is seams. They could be a seam that forms because of boulders forming a pocket in the river. It could be a seam that forms from a log jam. They could be just a braiding thing where two currents, where the river forks around something and then comes back together. That's a classic one and one of my favorites as well. Could be anything like that that will form a seam. So seams are one of the first things I always tackle, and it's because there's two speeds of water coming together, and it gives the trout a place to rest. And we've all seen trout sit there that look like they're not even moving. That's because they're utilizing the fact that that water in that seam will basically just hold them right there, and they're very good at making small adjustments to be able to hold there. That's what the seams are all about. The next place I'm going to always look at is going to be the pressure spots, which is where the water pushes up against something and creates slack water in front of it. Good way to describe that, you've probably all seen videos of a porpoise pushing ahead of a boat. The boat's going 30 miles an hour, and the porpoise is able to swim along right in front of him and play in the wave. That's because that boat is pushing a pressure wave of water, and that is a dead spot in the water where the dolphin can just get pushed along in the same way that a surfer gets pushed along. The spots in front of rocks or log jams or anything hard in the river does the same thing. You'll get a stack of water right there that doesn't move, and we call those pillows. There's a soft spot in the water up against a rock. So the current could be ripping down the middle of a run somewhere and then hit a big rock and split around it. And when it does, it's going to create a pillow right in the front of the rock. And the most aggressive trout is going to sit right there, because when they sit there, that gives them first opportunity at anything coming down there. They can sit there without burning energy, and they can dart out and grab whatever they want. And so I love to fish pillow biters, so to speak, the ones that are in the pillows, and they lunge out and grab whatever comes by on either side of the rock. So those are really good places to fish as well. I love to address fish that are at the head or a tail of a riffle. And a riffle typically occurs where a pool of some sort or a run of some sort comes up against shallow water enough that the whole surface is now broken. And riffles are shallow. They are excellent places for trout to feed, because as the rest of the water from the big pool builds up and hits that riffle, it will then create effectively a seam right on the bottom. And we'll come back to that in a second, but it'll be tight to the bottom as it flows over those riffles, and it will give trout an excellent place to sit there and catch a lot of stuff. So if you want to catch numbers of fish, the day you're hoping for is when they're all sitting right at the head or the tail of a riffle. And a lot of times you'll find the biggest ones at the head and the smallest ones at the tail, or vice versa. But a lot of times the seniority will be placed in terms of the size of the fish that get to feed in that scenario, will be placed at one end or the other depending on what the actual food source might be. So if the food source is coming out of the hole or the run, it'd be one thing. If it's coming down the fast part of the river, it'd be another thing. So it just depends on where the fish are located, where the food source is coming from. That's going to dictate where the rest of it transpires. So that's what that's all about. So if I can find fish at the head or the tail of a riffle, then I know that I can catch a whole bunch of them there. And that's usually something I will do. That typically involves swinging something across rather than swimming it up or down. So for instance, the tail of a riffle, I'll throw all the way across, let the current swing it down just like you were swinging streamers, and let it swing across the tail of the riffle just before it dumps into wherever is going down below it. That will allow fish to come forward and grab whatever is right there, and it gives you a great chance at catching them. If they're at the head of the riffle, then I tend to throw into the faster water, let it drift into the riffle, and let them come find it. Because if they're at the head of the riffle, they're going to be relatively aggressive as well. So then I'll go that route. Then from there, I'm going to look at the runs. And the reason that I go to runs third, I'll be the first to admit there's probably typically more fish in the runs in any given river than there are any riffles. And what do I mean by a run? A run is a deep spot in the river, typically where it gets narrower, and it will concentrate the current down a chute of some sort, and it's typically deep in an even current. And there may be some things on the bottom or whatever, but it's an area that gives fish safety as far as depth goes. Typically, as with anything else, there'll be a seam along the bottom of the river. And again, I need to get back to that point, which I'll do here in a second. It gives them, depending on the river, it could be 3, 4, 5, 10 feet of water to work with. So it's quite a bit by river standards. And they can move up and down in the column as the light bothers them or doesn't bother them, as the case might be, and all of those things. And runs hold a lot of fish, but that extra depth means that I have to be a little bit more tuned in with my lure and my depth range that I'm presenting at, particularly if the water is off color. And the reason is, if there's, let's say the run is 6 feet deep. Well, if you run a bait run to the surface up high, they may not see it if at all because they're too deep. If you run it down deep and the fish are up high in the run, which is very possible, you won't see it because you're running under them. Versus a riffle or a seam along an edge or a seam along two current lines, I know they're going to see my bait, and then I can decide whether or not did they bite it or not, and I can do that really quickly. In a run, I might have to work through a few different baits just to determine for sure, or make absolutely certain that they have been presented the opportunity to see my lure at close enough range that they might find it. And at the end of the day, trout are sight feeders first and foremost, so that can be really important. So if I'm fishing runs, if I know they're in the runs for sure, then I can concentrate on that. But if I'm trying to figure it out as quickly as possible, and the really core of this podcast is to be, how do I locate them? I'm going to hit the seams on the edges first. The seams in the middle, as two currents come together, second. Third, I'm hitting the pillows. Fourth, I'm hitting the top and the bottom of the riffles, starting with the bottom actually, and then going to the top. Then I'm going to the runs. And then I'll start working the water column out from there, and then I'll start looking at things like plunge pools. Now, plunge pools are deep. Typically, the current back swirls on both sides. Fish could be facing any direction. They may be there purely to rest and not feeding at all, because it's the least amount of effort they can expend. And we've all stood on top of a rock and looked down and seen 30 trout in a pool, and they aren't doing anything. And that's because they're all there resting. Those same fish will disperse to seams or riffles or whatever when it comes time to eat, when food starts really coming down the river at a high level. So that can be very important as well. So pools are often the first place to attract particularly casual anglers, but they're the last place that I want to fish as a hardcore angler, because they're the hardest to work out and they can tend to have the least motivated fish. So that's the biggest thing there, is why I don't do that. Now, pockets. Let's talk about pockets. Pockets are very small. Basically, they're really small little pools, for lack of a better way to put it. Typically, they're generated by a rock in the river, and pocket water, we've all heard of the term pocket water, is where there's a bunch of rocks that are typically emergent from the surface, and they create a little dead spot behind each one of them. A lot of guys think the trout are in the pockets, and sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're in the seam on one side or the other of the pocket, and landing in that pocket will potentially get you a chance at those fish. But fishing pocket water demands casting accuracy and line control because they're typically shallow, small targets in the grand scheme of things, as opposed to a big old plunge pool, which may be too big to even cast across. But fishing those pockets can be really good. When I'm fishing pockets, it's typically for smaller fish, much I hate to say it, but that's generally what you're going to locate in pocket water, is smaller than average fish, because they have the smallest opportunity for feeding, for one, and they tend to be shallow spots. Two, there's generally a lot of them on a given scenario. So if you're in good pocket water, there's lots of little pockets. You got to make a lot of casts. And in that scenario, I'll do just the opposite of the high and muddy water. I will downsize to something small that I can get instantaneous line control and hoping for an instantaneous bite. So in other words, my bait hits the water, there's a fish on it immediately, as soon as it hits the water, as opposed to drifting it or retrieving it. That's typically a jig scenario for me. But a pocket can be really good, but again, you need to focus on your accuracy and your line control. As soon as the bait, literally before the bait hits the water, you need to have the bail closed and be ready, because trout are extremely quick about finding something in a pocket and grabbing it and then spitting it out if they don't like it. And if you don't have perfect control, it's a great way to snag as well. Now, let's talk quickly about one other key concept, and that is the slack water at the bottom of the river. There's always slack water right along the bottom of the river, in the same way that there's vortices along the edge of the river that I mentioned already, along the bottom as well, because the bottom is not super smooth. If it had a concrete flat bottom like a swimming pool, there wouldn't be much of a seam on the bottom, but because there's stuff on the bottom that breaks up that current flow and makes it not so smooth. Now I have some turbulent water, and a fish will invariably find some place to sit and be slack. So one of the key things I tell people is, if you can work a jig tight to the bottom with control, you're going to be way ahead of a lot of other anglers in a river situation, because whether I'm fishing seams or anything else, lure control is really important. And being able to tick that bottom, I call it tickle jigging in still water, where you're just barely ticking the bottom. As soon as the bait's slowing down and slacking out at the bottom, you pick up on it just enough to keep it moving. If you can do that, then that opens a whole bunch of the river up as far as being able to catch the fish, starting with pocket water, which is why I used it as a transition, all the way through also the runs, because if the fish are at the bottom of the runs, using a heavier jig and just ticking the bottom with it is a great way to address those fish as well. Same thing with seams along the edges. If you're really good at making the cast right on the bank, and I mean on the bank, I would like to see the cast land within 6 inches of the bank all the time, and then have instant line control, and then you can follow it down with the rod and tick it down an edge like that. You're going to catch a lot more fish. But fundamentally, the key thing to take away from this is the breakdown of, no different than I would in still water, of what type of water do they want. And that will change over the course of a day, and maybe even over the course of a couple hours, as maybe a hatch develops or goes away, maybe mud starts to come in, maybe the water warms up a little bit, maybe something you can't even determine happens, like sculpins decide to start feeding, or whatever. Maybe an angler, 300 yards upstream starts walking around and kicking stuff loose enough to wake trout up, and the ones that you're now fishing are now more alert than they were before that guy walked in the river up there. So those kinds of things will affect it over the course of the day, but it's so easy to catalog and decide, right? Because I can say, okay, I have thrown at 4 seams, I've had no feedback. I've thrown it at a couple of runs, I've had no feedback. I threw at the tail end of a riffle and got chased. Okay, well, now I got some feedback, right? And then you can work from there. And that feedback will help you from there, and then you can determine, okay, I got chased at the tail of this riffle. The very next riffle, I'd be willing to bet you're going to get chased at the tail of it again, and that's pattern fishing 101. If you find them in deep runs in one area, you're going to find them in deep runs in the other area, almost guaranteed. So it's just easier to define, as opposed to a lake where there's no rhyme or reason to the directions, or the shoreline may not have anything to do with a particular direction, things like that. Whereas the river always runs one way, always wears the same way, always does the same basic thing. And so it's more consistent for the fish. And since it has different types of water, you can use that as a system to categorize. So fundamentally, look at it like that. Look at each type of water that they could hold in and make some casts to those, and then go from there. And then the last thing I'll throw out here before we wrap this up is casting angles are going to count a lot in the river. Whether you cast upstream, downstream, or across stream is going to be very important. As a general rule, as I'm throwing, if I'm throwing a hard plug of some sort, I'm going to throw across and maybe slightly up, and I'm going to work it, let it drift and work it across. If I'm throwing a jig, I could throw it straight up, or across, either one, because the jig I can literally just let drift down current and still get pretty good bites with it. Or if I'm throwing something like an inline spinner or spoon, it's going to be closer to a hard plug, where I'm going to throw it across more often than not. In both of those scenarios, I want to keep that bait moving commonly. And the only time I'm going to retrieve a bait straight upstream is when I'm working seams themselves. And I will do that if I'm working streams, or seams, I should say. And then the other thing I'll do is I'll hold a bait in the current in something like a run, where I just steer it and just let it hold and let it swim in the current. Can be a great way to get them caught. But fun, if you think about it as different types of water, and make exploratory casts into each type, and making note of where you're getting feedback, whether it be chases, bites, or actually catching fish, that will help you out the most. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you want to join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, please do that at Fishful Thinker. Hopefully you'll subscribe while you're there, and also check out and see what we're up to on Altitude Sports Entertainment and World Fishing Network. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.